Welcome to the Education Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. Here in our PCRF Journal Club, we promote evidence-based practices by critically evaluating the latest science in emergency medical services. We hope our discussion will help advance EMS practice. Through the generous support of our sponsor, Limmer Education, we can make science more accessible and understandable. Okay, welcome everyone to a special episode here, a mini episode here, and a discussion of the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Education Research Journal Club. We are here live from the National Association of EMS Educators Symposium. This is in Reno, Nevada. We wish you were here with us if you're not here, but if you're sitting at home and listening to this or watching it later, this has just been a phenomenal event, and we want to share some things with you, especially one common theme and really what turns out to be such an important piece of research out there, an article that has come out. And we have one of the co-authors here today and one of our regular panelists, Kim McKenna, to join us. I'm Megan Corry, and I'm here with Kim McKenna, and we're going to be discussing an article that has been mentioned several times. So just to kind of go back, we're here in Reno, we're at the Symposium. They've had several days of pre-cons that have been, just incredibly exciting. Beyond the instructor courses, there's now the new skills instructor course. There's a Cultural Humility Summit, Cultural Humility 101. There were a number of pre-cons that were really incredibly deep and interesting. And now the conference really has had this common thread going through it of evidence. So what are we doing with evidence? We see this just kind of running through. I'm curious about Kim's take on that. Evidence-based medicine, like how do we teach it, the content of what we teach, and then also evidence-based teaching practices, things like are we promoting and using teaching practices that we know support retention and long-term learning?
I agree. That seems to be a theme for the conference. And there's also been a lot of information on clinical judgment, clinical decision-making, which is really important because when the new exams launch July 1 of 2024.
2024.
I should
know.
July 1 of 2024. People need to be ready and know exactly what that means. And so it's been really great to see a lot of information about that.
Yeah, this is great. And it's great to bring just a half an hour to you of some of this information. So one of the things that has come up, again, common theme about evidence. And when it comes to teaching evidence-based medicine, so that piece of it, the content, what we teach, and are we kind of up with the times and the latest and the most promising or best practices? The problem that has been identified and that we're probably all familiar with as educators is information overload. So we get information from all different angles, right? Podcasts and journal clubs and, blogs and new articles and, all different sources, textbooks, of course, courseware, all kinds of other things. So what does that mean for us? What are the implications for educators? And then also, what are the implications for the certification exam, the high stakes exam, because they go together. We need to be able to teach what we know. This not only the students are going to practice, but what they are going to be expected to demonstrate that they are verifying that they have the competency to practice in this profession.
Yeah. And as an educator, what do you do if you have two sources and they're giving you conflicting information, And so this paper sort of helps to answer that question by identifying what is the hierarchy of evidence that you should be looking at. And it also makes transparent kind of how the exams team at the National Registry is going to be looking at the evidence when they're trying, same thing, if they're trying to decide, one textbook has this information, another textbook has that information, where are they going to go for the evidence? So I think it's going to really help educators to kind of understand where they should be looking for information.
Yeah, this, it struck me too. It's very important for organizations of educators as well, like NAEMSE, to be actively involved in this. And so this paper, by the way, is in not pre-hospital emergency care, pre-hospital and disaster medicine. It is open access. It is the consensus standard for evidence integration into EMS education and high stakes testing. And so I'm going to point you to another podcast too that's out there that we've mentioned before, EMS Educator by Prodigy. They just did an episode on this. I believe it was called, Is It Going to Be on the Test? And I listened to it actually. So what I would suggest that you go and listen to that, because Ash Panchal's on it, Kim is on it, Chris Gage is on it, and they talk more about the kind of process and methodology. We have half an hour. We want to maybe skim through that and then get right to some of the implications, because we're at the Educator Conference, and that's sort of my main concern right now is, what does this mean for me? Like, how am I going to have to know these? Am I going to have to know these, randomized controlled trials that come out and integrate that into my teaching? What does it mean for textbooks? All these other things. So we will do a little summary though of the study itself. So if you can just tell me, what is this task force that they came up with? So let me just say that we know the problem. The objective then was to develop some type of a standardized process, a framework to evaluate and integrate new material into the competency assessment, therefore into what we teach to help people get to the competency assessment. So the task force, unfortunate timing to develop that task force, wasn't it? Was it pre-COVID?
It was during COVID, but it was all online, so that at least was helpful. And the task force consisted of folks that were very experienced in education. A lot of those names you would know. Paul Rosenberger was on it before he actually joined the National Registry staff. Art Seo was on it, Walt Stoy, just Baxter Larman, a lot of people that you know from the education industry. And then there were a lot of folks that were from the research side. So Christian Martingill and a lot of the people from the Pre-Hospital Guidelines Consortium were also on the panel. And Ash Panchal then took us through a series of exercises, I guess you could say, in the Delphi process to go through the different rounds to, first of all, identify what's out there in terms of evidence. So that was kind of the round one of it. Like, what's out there? What are all the evidence types? And then what is the purpose?
Nice. He was asking us if we ate lunch.
Further delineate what is the purpose of that education, then in the round two, and then to categorize it a little bit by type. And then in round three, we generated sort of a preliminary table of evidence in terms of, what should be the highest levels and what are the medium levels and then the lower levels. And then also, what are those in each of those levels? What is the primary objective of each of those types of evidence? In other words, is it primary research? Is it basic patient care recommendations? Is it just general education? And then finally, kind of how is that evidence going to be integrated into high stakes examinations?
And then where does the education piece then come into it? We know about there is an emphasis on the high stakes exam, but then the education that leads to it. So,
well, I think that as part of this, then sort of the second part of this, which Chris Martingill and Paul Rosenberger are going to actually talk about in detail tomorrow, is that the National Registry has formed an agreement with the PGC to every 2 years evaluate new evidence-based guidelines that are out there. And they did that in 2022, and they found 75 new evidence-based guidelines that they reviewed, and then they identified 24 of those guidelines that met the National Academy of Medicine guidelines. And then those are now included in this resource document that educators can access on the PGC website. And so that's kind of one way that educators can use this information, is to go to those evidence-based guidelines and make sure that they are familiar with the content, number one, And number two, then integrate it as appropriate into their EMS education. So, for example, some of them, one of the articles relates to ketamine. So if you are teaching EMR, it's probably not going to be relevant to you as an educator, to your learners. So you're going to have to go through there, and it helps an educator kind of determine what is the highest quality evidence-based guideline that's out there. And at a minimum, it's certainly not the only thing you should be teaching in terms of new research and whatnot, but at a minimum, I need to be aware of this, and I need to be teaching this information.
Now, you mentioned the PGC a few times, and this is a resource we as educators are going to need to be, if we're not already, very familiar with. So you'll see at the end of this, I do have a page that shows what the PGC is, that they're a homepage, but can you go back and just, when was that formed, and what is it? Do you remember? I mean, is this
I honestly don't know exactly when it was formed, but it's a group of researchers, pre-hospital researchers. And so you'll recognize some familiar names, Rebecca Cash, Remley Crow. There are physicians. There are really well-known names in EMS research that are regularly reviewing evidence-based guidelines. And they have just formalized this relationship now with the National Registry, so that the registry will have that information, new information coming every 2 years.
Yeah.
And, I feel like just having that information put in front of us will sort of help with that sort of knowledge translation into practice in the field, because it kind of helps us understand what's out there so that we can make sure that we're integrating it within our lessons.
Yeah, I think it's something, it's a common thing that we think about education and research as separate things, and an educator and a researcher as separate. So one of my thoughts is that maybe some educators don't know about the PGC because, it's research, and if you go to the NAEMSE website, even they have a nice little page on the PGC, and maybe people haven't heard of it, but that's actually going to be a very important thing going forward here, in particular, stemming from this document here. So looking at the tables, and again, this is an open access article, so please go in and get it. It is a pre-hospital and disaster medicine, just released this year, I believe, or recent. So here's your tables of evidence, and this is the tables that you worked on in this group. Right. So you started out with, and we've gone through Delphi process before. So if you've listened to this webinar, you've heard that we've had Delphi. We've talked about the actual process when we talked about the development of the priorities for EMS education research, the priorities for, in the light of COVID, we talked about something there, and talked about the iterative nature of the Delphi. So in the first round, you all got a chance to just kind of throw in, well, what are the sources of information that people are using to get their information? Right.
It was like one big bucket, and you just threw everything in there without really considering what the quality was, what the purpose of it was. And it was just basically one big bucket of information. Yeah.
And then just going back for a second in this round, then you started looking at, what was the purpose of the evidence, and then you categorized. So you had this came up into these two tables, right?
Right.
Okay.
So if you look at table 1, it's the ranking of the quality of evidence by the panel. And so the highest quality of evidence are evidence-based guidelines that meet those NAM, the National Academy of Medicine guidelines, which is a guideline that helps you. It's basically a checklist to evaluate the quality of the research. What was the research design, was the bias, all kinds of information about the research to determine its quality. And then, of course, randomized controlled trials were there, and systematic reviews also kind of made that level 1. And then you go all the way down to the lowest quality of evidence, and you have just, informal crowdsourced projects. Think about like Rotten Tomato, if you're going to put a movie, right? Rotten Tomatoes. Yeah. And then case series, just an expert lecture that you might hear at a conference like this. And it's not like this. It's not like those things don't have value in that lowest level, But when you're using them for a high stakes exam, you have to go and validate that. Even if you're using them as an educator, you want to go and validate that evidence, that research, before you put it in your own high stakes exams in your class. You can't just say that this is the definitive source.
Yeah, you brought up a great point about earlier about the use of podcasts, though, in how you like them for identifying, oh, maybe I'll go pull that paper.
Right.
So we listened to Jeff Jarvis on, EMS Lighthouse, or, the PEC podcast, when they're identifying these studies or doing a little, article review. And, and you're like, well, you know what? I think I'm going to go check that out myself. So,
exactly.
Yeah. So
you need to go to the source still.
Yeah.
And especially, if it's not the author, the first author that's presenting it, you really want to go to the source and pull the article if it's information that you're going to use to form the foundation for the education that you're giving.
Yeah. And then I noticed that medium quality of evidence had to be leveled as well. You had just a volume of things in here, including education standards and regulatory standards and national model clinical guidelines, something, a document I really like, position statements, all of these things. I guess the airway compendium would fall into that group somewhere, position statements, maybe. I'm not sure where that would fall in, but somewhere in here, because it's based upon research and a consensus, but it's really a compendium of positions, I guess.
Right.
So that I thought of that because we used that this year in our education program. I had students read different elements of the airway compendium. So yeah, how to use this sort of in education is another piece. And then table 2, tell me what's table 2 now.
So the table 2 just sort of looked at what were the primary objectives of that particular resource. Was it going to be a specific recommendation for patient care? Was it primary research that was introducing new knowledge? Or was it just sort of informational and educational content that was going to be kind of an amalgamation of other original research or other information that was out there?
Okay, so then we go from here. So we've categorized, we've weighted, and we've categorized. So now where do we go from here? You kind of synthesize that, right? You put it together into a couple of tables. If there's a final combined table of evidence here, and then there's going to be another one that's a recommendation about how it impacts the exam.
Exactly.
I think is really kind of where it hits. So looking at this, we're putting the weight in together with the 3 areas: recommendations for care, primary research, and noticing that informational or educational content. You see the education standards and textbooks and those things tend to have lower weight or quality of evidence, whereas other things, evidence-based guidelines, and maybe the compendium goes in there, I'm not sure, or regulatory standard, those kind of, and actually primary research is in there as a systematic review. Meta-analysis or randomized controlled trials are in that box,
it
right?
Depends on the design, where it got categorized in terms of the quality of evidence. But still, really anything that is like a B2 or higher is considered to be as able to be included as a primary source of evidence for the exams team, for example.
Yeah.
And, when you think about it, other sources down lower than that, textbooks, for example, as soon as a textbook comes out, anymore, it's impossible to keep up with the new evidence. Like you could go to the PEC journal and look. I was going weekly and looking at, what are the new articles coming out? And there would be consensus statements and all this new kind of stuff. And so the textbooks, once they come out, they don't get revised, but every 5 years.
Yeah.
And so it's not enough just to look at the textbook. It's important. I mean, I say that with full disclosure as a textbook author, it's important, but it can't be the only thing when you're teaching, especially, like you said, a high stakes topic like airway management, where things are changing all the time. in terms of what the recommendations are, and even what the tools are sometimes have changed within that span of 5 years now.
Yeah, let's look at the last table, and then I have a couple of questions about how we're going to interpret this as educators as well. So the last table is a combined table of evidence that tells us about the impact of all of this on that national registry exam, on the initial certification exam. And I noticed they use the term initial certification exam. Is that, I wonder if that is intentional, because not, are we assuming this is a national registry exam? So I think that was an interesting terminology. I just sort of noticed that right now. But when we put this in here, when we look at this table, it's telling us that if something high quality, that has may have high impact, we've got to actually look at this immediately, right? If you're a test designer or a test writer, this is something that has to be looked at immediately.
So, I mean, think about probably the example that most people understand is when the new AHA guidelines come out every 5 years. So as soon as those guidelines come out, some programs are going to start adopting them like immediately. However, the research would say that sometimes it takes 2 years or even 4 years or longer for some systems to adopt those guidelines. So the trick is that when it's high stakes like that, they have to the exams team can look very discreetly at items and look and see, let's say a dose for atropine changes, and all of a sudden they're saying you should give atropine 2 milligrams instead of the current amount, right? So they have to look through the exam. Any item that might be directly impacted, they do what they call masking the item, where they will pull it out of the bank until they have the opportunity to put it through a review cycle, so that it's sort of like you're in purgatory almost during that time while people are implementing new information. So that's why sometimes for people, it feels like it takes a long time for the exam to change. And the registry is pretty transparent about when they're going to, change things. But they do have a very deliberative, there was a great session this morning on item development. And it's a very deliberate process to review items that goes through about 6 steps or more before an item finally goes live. And so once an item gets pulled out, then it goes back into part of that cycle. It may not be completely pulled out, but so it's going to take a while for it to go back in then.
There's sort of implications too for continuing education, right? So we've got the initial education, the certification, and then the continuing education. And since our preceptors are really on that latter end, there is some mixing. I remember when 12 lead EKGs first came out, and at some point there was that crossover where our students were teaching some of their preceptors about 12 leads. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, if you look at the NCCP for the National Registry, which is going to be updated, these evidence-based guidelines are going to be integrated within the NCCP as well as the 10 articles that the PGC has reviewed. Now, they're going to be optional, but they're going to be integrated in there. So to try and close that gap so that the folks that are teaching continuing education will also look to this information, hopefully, so that they can keep up with what the entry-level students are learning. So
yeah,
it's all a complicated web already in that world.
It is. When I see these tables though, too, I'm going to actually move it to this page because I think it's such an important thing to get across. We have a few minutes left with you. And yeah, great. So we want to talk about we need some guidance as educators. So where should we go from here? And if we're leaders within, you're a program director, an instructional leader, and you have a bunch of adjuncts as well, where do we go from here in looking at this?
So if you just pulled up the opening page for the Pre-Hospital Guidelines Consortium, and if you go down onto the second line where it says EBG resources, there's a page that says the 2022 EBG guidelines. I can't remember the exact title of the page. And that's where you're going to find those 24 evidence-based guidelines. Now, some of them are going to look familiar because they are evidence-based guidelines that were integrated actually into the last update of the American Heart Association guidelines. So it's not all going to be like, oh, this is brand new, it's scary or whatever. But it's set up really nicely in that it has the title of the article. It will tell you whether it's open access or whether it's not open access. It has a link directly to the article. And when you click on the article itself, you can go to the abstract and a brief synopsis of what are the key take-home points from that article. So that if you're in a system like I was in the last few years of my last job, where you couldn't pull articles from scholarly databases all the time, that, you know, unless they were open, that you'll at least understand, okay, here are the key changes that I need to pay attention to here. And then if you really need to have the article, your medical director often can help you get those source articles. And so it's a great resource. And then the second part of that is the EMS professionals reading list. And this is more going to be used more for continuing competency rather than for the exams team. But the team at the PGC solicited articles from like the NAEMSE and EMS community. What did people feel like were the most impactful articles that had come out? Yeah. And so they received all of those, and then their reviewers then graded them from 1 to 5 on a Likert scale and scored them. And then they include there the top 10 articles that they felt were going to be impactful to us in EMS agencies, so that I feel like as an educator, it really helps you kind of pare things down and say, if I don't have time to read everything, I need to at least read these 10, because this peer review process kind of looked at these and felt like these were important things for us to know as EMS educators. And some of them feel more hospital related, but they're kind of going to help, like in terms of STEMI, for example. They'll help make transport decisions, like who should go directly to a STEMI center versus who can I take to the community hospital? Yeah.
Now I need an audiobook version of it. So that's the one thing about reading lists is, it'd be great to have a screen reader or something for drive. If those of you who drive and listen to podcasts and everything, that's the one thing that's great about podcasts too. You can hear them if you're doing a lot of driving. It'd be great to have an audio version.
Yeah, you can't see the figures. So that's the only problem.
That's true.
Often with those articles, the figures and the graphs and are really essential to understanding, kind of what the key messages are. So, yeah. Well, with a couple of minutes left, just looking at the Pre-Hospital Guidelines Consortium, definitely a place to go, prehospitalguidelines.org. You've got the evidence-based guidelines link there. You can see, you can learn a little bit about them. And also the EMS professionals reading list is linked right there. So at least it gives us a start. I know it's a little overwhelming. The other thing I keep thinking about is, what will this mean for the way that we create textbooks? Will textbook production change with the, I know out in my area, open education resources and zero textbook cost is a big move. Some, have moved in that direction. And when it comes to other, subjects like biology and other things where they've created things that don't change as much, have created some zero textbook cost options. And there's a lot of discussion about being able to do that in some areas using things like this, making it more of a liquid textbook than a static. Right. I predicted that would happen like 5 years ago or so, or I think even longer ago. I said, our hard copy textbooks are going to go away. But then I found that the learners want the hard copy in their hands many times. So that hasn't changed as quickly as I thought it was going to, but it's inevitable because that's the only way to keep up is
Yeah.
if it's electronic, then you could kind of update on the fly
Yeah.
some of the essential things. Obviously, you're not going to deal with the minutia in between revision cycles, but yeah, it's really getting harder because there's so much new evidence. There's so many great researchers out in their field now, which is super exciting.
Yeah. And, one of the things I thought about too is if we asked our students that same question that we asked the panel, the first, like what sources of information do you use? I thought about, I think maybe I'll survey my students.
Yeah.
What information sources did you use throughout paramedic school? The ones at the end, and which ones were, and weight them and see what they came out as the things that were the most important.
That's a great idea.
You can researchers out there
or a research project,
or one of you could, or all of us can, and we can talk. All right. Any other final kind of comments? We have like a minute left. And
no, I mean, I think that if you are teaching initial education or continuing education, you need to be familiar with these documents so that you understand how information is going to be looked at when it's going to be integrated into that high stakes exam.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great resource. It sort of is another way the registry is trying to create transparency to help us understand how the exams are conducted.
Yeah, this has just been a phenomenal symposium integrating all of these aspects. And next year it's in Pittsburgh. So you might want to check out the NAEMSE website and start planning for funding maybe to get you to Pittsburgh and see, what's happened since then or since today. Thank you all for joining us. We will be back next week, just next week, 1 week on our regular time, 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central. And we're going to be talking about simulation-based training and its use amongst practicing paramedics and EMTs. It's an evidence-based systematic review. And since we got the super steady person here, if you remember the simulation use and paramedic education research study that happened 8 years ago, I think it was published.
In Reno, we presented it.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
Yes.
8 years ago.
Yeah.
And we're going to be able to, see where we've been since then. But there is another one Monday, September 11th with Dr. Emily Crow, Dr. Tony Fernandez. So join us live each month. You can register at prehospitalcare.org. And remember, you can catch us on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@PCRF@UCLA. And all of these are recorded, so you can go back and listen. All right. See you next Friday. We hope you have enjoyed and learned from this PCRF Journal Club. Please share it with other interested EMS professionals. An archive of past journal clubs can be found at www.pcrfpodcasts.org. You can also find us on Facebook at PCRF@UCLA and on our website at www.prehospitalcare.org. A special thank you to our sponsor, Limmer Education, providing education tools for success at every stage of your EMS journey.